Thanks, Steve. I'm Kevin Dettmar. I teach at Pomona College, 20 miles east on the 210, something like that. And like the rest of you, I hope, excited to be here. Our panel this afternoon is called Countermappings, and I'm just going to briefly introduce our speakers in the order of their presentations. Greg Winston is Professor of English and Chair of Humanities and Social Sciences at Husson University in Bangor, Maine. His research takes historical and environmental approaches to Irish and British modernism. He is the author of Joyce and Militarism, published by the University of Florida Press, as well as essays on James Joyce, Joseph Conrad, George Moore, and Lady Augusta Gregory. He was the 2020 Fulbright Scholar in Irish Literature at Queen's University, Belfast. Megan Cole will be next. Megan is a writer, editor, and PhD student in English with a designated emphasis in critical theory at the University of California, Irvine. She primarily studies 19th and 20th century American fiction, eco-criticism, energy humanities, and environmental humanities. And finally, Paul Saint-Amour. Paul is the Walter H. and Lenore C. Professor in the Humanities and Chair of English at the University of Pennsylvania. He is the author of The Copyrights, Intellectual Property, and the Literary Imagination, and Tense Future, Modernism, Total War, Encyclopedic Form. Paul has served as president of the Modernist Studies Association, which is a real rogues gallery, that list, and is currently a member of the supervising committee of the English Institute and a trustee of the International James Joyce Foundation. Some years ago, he chaired a Joyce Foundation task force on copyright status of Joyce's work. He edited the collection Modernism and Copyright and co-edited with Jessica Berman the Modernist Latitudes series at Columbia University Press. So, Greg?
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks to the Huntington, to Pomona for hosting us, bringing us together for this remarkable centenary. It's an honor to be here. As my title suggests, I'm going to talk about questions of geography, and to consider the ways that Joyce's fiction incorporates geography, I want to bear in mind just how significant the topic was in late 19th century Ireland. As a scientific discipline, administrative tool, and school subject, it became a focus of debate and controversy. In September 1899, the United Irishman newspaper published this column titled Learning Geography by Calraid, one of many pseudonyms for editor Arthur Griffith. It relates the experience of a hypothetical Irish student named Tom, who at first, eager to learn geography, finds his enthusiasm stifled by 3 successive national schools. The maps are so antique, the textbooks so anglocentric, arbitrary, or inaccurate, that by the end of his course, writes Griffith, he had but a confused outline of the world in his head. Griffith's remedy to the confusion is to refocus on the local. Instead of a world atlas or Mercator projection, he recommends each school have a map of its own district on which the houses, roads, fields, and every prominent feature are marked so as to be easily identified by the pupils when the teacher has explained the purpose of a map. Griffith, for his part, does not explain the purpose of a map, but he does suggest how to repurpose one. He suggests taking the Ordnance Survey 6-inch to 1-mile townland sheets, colored as near as practicable to nature, and hanging them in every local classroom. Produced by British Army sapper units, the survey maps were intended for purposes of colonial administration, military control, and land valuation, but not education. But Griffith contends that posting 2 sheets in each local school will awaken a far different interest in the students. Awaken a far different interest. The phrase sounds as cryptic and revolutionary as one might expect of the future Sinn Féin founder. Once they learn to identify their own surroundings in the townland sheets, students can then proceed to the map of their county, writes Griffith, eventually to the map of Ireland, beyond which, to the majority of Irish scholars, though, it is not necessary to go. Another United Irishman column from November 1900, titled Irish Topography, began, quote, among the many other subjects which the national schools and in fact most other educational institutions in Ireland have tabooed is Irish topography. Of the geography of the British Isles, says the intermediate program, a minute knowledge will be required, general knowledge of the geography of the British Empire, with special knowledge of the railway systems of the United Kingdom, say the civil service programs. And the unfortunate scholar is primed with the height of Mount Everest, the length of the Ganges, the density of the Dead Sea, and the junction of the London Northwestern. But of Ireland, he is told next to nothing. Articles like these were a fixture of the United Irishman, and as a longtime reader of the paper, James Joyce would have seen many of them. They represent a contemporary context for reading moments in Joyce's fiction that feature geography as image, perspective, theme, or form. His depiction of textbooks and schoolrooms, maps, and measurements show an engagement with geography as cultural discourse and scientific discipline. If the United Irishman focused on learning geography as a means to national liberation, Joyce shows its potential to awaken a far different interest by emphasizing its situated and dialogic realities. A portrait of the artist as a young man represents geography as not merely a detached science of fixed facts, but an evolving intersubjective dialogue. Ulysses extends and complicates this discourse when it imagines and applies its new geography emerging at the confluence of modern science and modernist literature. Chapter 1 of A Portrait echoes Griffith's concern that faraway facts and imperial textbooks might lead Irish students into confusion. Stephen's first geography lessons are with Dante Reardon, who taught him where the Mozambique Channel was and what was the longest river in America and what was the name of the highest mountain in the moon. Such diverse and distant trivia confirm the narrator's claim that Dante knew a lot of things, but their random nature and lack of context risk leaving Stephen, just like Tom, with but a confused outline of the world in his head. In response, Stephen, of course, famously makes this outline. Marjorie Howes notes the absence of the United Kingdom from this list, a meaningful omission that places Ireland in a European frame. And given A Portrait's first publication in December 1916, it does suggest an echo of the proclamation of the Republic made 8 months before on Dublin streets. Emerging nation and disappearing empire are just part of the picture, however, in which young Stephen is placed, or I should say places himself. For remember, this moment is grounded not in indirect narration, but direct replication of Stephen's writing. Where else but on the flyleaf or blank front page of a geography book, an unnamed text at Clongowes, presumably in response to what is or is not contained within. I've written about how the two school books Joyce does name in the chapter suggest an Anglo-American hegemony over Irish education, even at an independent Jesuit school like Clongowes. I won't retrace those steps here, except to say that Stephen's school book, whether by what it includes or what it excludes, is a catalyst for his act of writing himself into a vast spatial imaginary or infinite scalar description. When another act of writing, the satirical poetic response from a classmate, appears on the facing page, A Portrait shows geography as a dialogue of competing perspectives. Written just for a cod or joke, Fleming's doggerel verse no less reveals political and theological dimensions of geographic thinking in its bold assertion of national identity and its substitution of heaven for Stephen's universe. When he turns the page to an illustration of a green globe surrounded by maroon clouds, Stephen associates the colors with those of Dante's hairbrushes, representing the political rivalry of Charles Stewart Parnell and Michael Davitt, leaving him to wonder which is right, to be for the green or for the maroon. Conflicting interests and competing agendas swirl like those clouds around the globe. In his definitive history of the discipline, David Livingstone describes modern geography as a contested enterprise. Stephen's schoolbook embodies that contested enterprise when it becomes a dynamic space in which emerging spatial perspectives confront one another, as well as official, authoritative ways of knowing. If A Portrait represents modern geography as a negotiable cultural discourse, Ulysses extends it to involve readers in increasingly radical ways. The practical question of school and curriculum is still there at the outset. In our first minutes with Leopold Bloom, we follow him around the corner to the butcher shop, next door to St. Joseph's National School, where through open windows, students can be heard at their morning lessons. The lesson focused on islands in the County Mayo Gaeltacht, Inishturk, Inishark, Inishboffin, would no doubt have pleased Griffith and others who regarded national school curricula as too Anglocentric. But it is also the Dublin diction and orthography that speak volumes here, as At Their Geography wonderfully restates the subject in a North Side accent. To rephrase its linguistic terms is to reframe its cultural meaning, granting the Dorset Street students a level of agency and ownership in the course content. The moment suggests a corrective to standard colonial education, as well as Anglo-Irish ascendancy domination of the scientific establishment that Colin Parsons has described in his work. Meanwhile, Bloom's direct identification with his namesake locale suggests an even more situated and personalized kind of geographic knowledge. The fact that the Slieve Bloom Mountains are geologically Ireland's oldest range perhaps connotes a sense of long-term belonging that counters other attempts later in the day to marginalize Bloom along intersecting lines of race, culture, and nationality. Mine, Slieve Bloom, is a silent thought, but also a succinct preview of the brave words he will utter aloud in Cyclops. Ireland. I was born here. Ireland. A direct assertion of natural citizenship and renouncement of the narrow-minded, racially based nationalism of the citizen. When we reach Ithaca, geographic references abound. They occur in topographic descriptions and toponymic lists, as well as scaled imagery that ranges from Cartesian coordinates to international maps and ordnance survey sheets. They include shifting scalar dimensions from the microscopic to the telescopic, alternatively looking deep into the earth and gazing way out into the stars. One of the fascinating paradoxes of Ithaca is how the presumably dispassionate dialogue of science is sometimes undermined or undermines itself by subjective tones or personalized perspectives. This happens specifically to the discourse of geography when we learn how maps figure in Bloom's first memories and future plans. His earliest recollection of his father includes constant consultation of a geographical map of Europe, political, while listening to Rudolf Verrog's narrative of his migration from Hungary to Ireland. At 6 years old, the same age as Stephen at Clongowes, the precocious young Bloom shows his commercial bent by imagining a business empire connecting the many cities of his father's migrations and settlements. Beyond the profit motive, the idea speaks to a desire for continuity or connection through the displacement of the immigrant experience. More than 3 decades later, maps enable Bloom to envision his own migration to certain localities in Ireland and abroad as a possible escape from the pain of Molly's infidelity and the attendant indignities of aging. In both instances, it is not the places but their cartographic description that holds the appeal. The maps are aesthetically alluring for their colors, polychrome design, and contour lines that contribute to their overall attractive character. The phrase seems as much literary as cartographic, suggesting how spatial awareness effectively emanates not only from grid lines, coordinates, and scales, but from a narrative connection to sympathetic protagonists or symbolic settings. Ireland, in fact, has such a literary-minded geography or geographically-minded literature, the genre known as Dinsenchas or place lore, a storytelling tradition that predates pictorial maps. Its tales situate place names within narratives that evoke mythic, historic, legal, and territorial meanings for the landscape. The Irish literary revival brought about renewed interest in the genre with a number of translations like this from Whitley Stokes of the Wren manuscript, a place-naming story with narrative links to the epic Toyne. Through an accumulation of place names and historical allusions, Dinsenchas forms a mind map of Irish pastoral boundaries and borderlands. Maria Tomasco writes in the Irish Ulysses that Joyce includes early place lore and geographic structures at the heart of all of his narratives. Of all 18 episodes in Ulysses, Ithaca most blatantly incorporates those structures with its long chain of question-answer style encyclopedic entries. The episode invites comparison to place lore with its own sequence of hundreds of story units, also in interrogational format. Whether parody or tribute, Ithaca shows the enduring relevance of the genre in the updated context and terms of modernism. We see a compressed enumerative echo of Dinsenchas in Bloom's imagined itinerary of escape. But devoid of narrative, this list of landmarks seems to have been wrenched from early Irish place lore and resituated in the context of modern commercial tourism. Within Bloom's narrative, however, specifically his reasons for leaving town, they carry a meaning that might hit a little too close to home. Given her upcoming concert tour of Ulster and possible cover for continuing the affair with Boylan, the prevalence of northern places, Belfast, the Giant's Causeway, and Lough Neagh, potentially puts Bloom right in the lover's path. Better to imagine points west or south if he does want to take his mind off their afternoon tryst. And his list of overseas locales does not appear much more diverting, given Gibraltar's significance as Molly's birthplace, or how Ceylon and the Dead Sea both figure in prior daydreaming moments that led Bloom to oppressive colonial imagery of problematic locales. Like Stephen's concentric outline, however, Bloom's spatial imaginary ultimately leaves these earthly places and tends towards the cosmos, a parallel John Hegland observes. Bloom's scalar expansion, culminating in his apotheosis as comet, leads to the fascinating and disorienting paradox of wandering to the extreme boundary of space while at the same time passing from land to land, among peoples, amid events. The cometary Bloom is at once perceiving subject and perceived object, and one who may or may not return. Still, return he does, self-compelled and sun-compelled, at the end of Ithaca. But where exactly? To Dublin? 7 Eccles Street? Molly's bed? This final fundamentally geographic question and its ambiguous or inconclusive reply, is it a punctuation mark, a cartographic symbol? Engage readers in spatial and narratological questioning. We arrive at this point and are prompted to ask not just where it is we have arrived, but what is the point? With its indeterminate quality, Austin Briggs writes, the dot seems to open up as much as it closes and can be seen as an aperture and not a stop. And for a number of critics, it is a window onto the spatial and the extraplanetary. To some, the point is dismally and dramatically terminal. Richard Kane reads it as not just the episode, but life itself coming to an end on the cosmic plane in the quintessence of dust. David Chinitz sees a black hole. Richard Ellman describes it in more positive astrophysical terms as Earth seen from interstellar space. Finally, the Earth may be considered the point of the book, as well as the Ithaca chapter. And Suzette Henke pushes it from the astrophysical to the metaphysical, describing it as a transspatial connection to the infinite. Now, I first reached the end of Ithaca this month, 30 years ago, when Ulysses was turning 70. And I came to associate its enlarged last dot with this one, photographed a year before by the Voyager spacecraft, taking a last look back at Earth. The picture was taken at the suggestion of Carl Sagan, who would later write, "Look at that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us." Ulysses, too, brings with the power of this extraterrestrial perspective a recognition that this is all we have and all we share. Joyce's black dot, like Sagan's pale blue one, is a mark of orientation and a container of who we are, of what we know. If we take the end of Ithaca, like Karen Lawrence suggests, as the parody of closure, preceding the real last word of Penelope, then its final earthly point is also an apt segue to Molly's monologue. For moments earlier, she is described as reclined semilaterally in the attitude of Giatellus, a fusion of Greco-Roman names for the earth goddess. And also, Gia, tell us. And she will, of course, in that incomparable, flowing monologue about to begin. On the ceiling above her are concentric circularities from the light and shadow of the bedside lamp, but also a reminder of the scalar expansions and contractions we have witnessed. As planetary pictograph and semiotic conflation of Mali and Earth, the enlarged last dot blends mythic association and linguistic origin. Its combined visual and verbal depiction recalls the etymological essence of geography as earth writing. Typography becomes topography, turning novel into map in a you are here sort of moment that beckons readers into the text space. In effect, Ithaca comes full circle here, for it began with this geometric or earth measuring description of Bloom's and Stevens' shortcut to Eccles Street. Their route draws a transect such as surveyors might use. It follows the straight line of the deserted late-night streets instead of the longer outer curve of the sidewalk at Hardwick Place. While this might just be a matter of saving some steps on the late-night walk back from Nighttown, I'm impressed by how it also forms an aerial image of concentric circularity, the spire atop St. George's Church, the traffic circus around it. While rooted in the local, the image also portends the immense scalar shifts to come. Perhaps it even recalls the concentric circularities once scribbled in a school geography book. Might we think of young Stephen Dedalus already beginning to imagine the new geography that was to become Ulysses? Certainly over its first 100 years, the novel has taught many readers to reimagine the spatial science in terms of social and cultural realities. It has demonstrated literature's unique ability to shed light on the interwoven issues of identity and belonging, displacement and migration, natural environment, national community, and cross-cultural engagement. Enduring issues all, and all with emergent, implicit questions. What is earth writing or place lore for 2022? How might we reimagine ourselves, our obligations to each other and to the world? Does Ulysses teach us this? In the first days of its second century, I think it still beckons readers into the same dynamic space for contemplating all of our questions of geography. Thank you.
Right, thank you so much, Greg. First, I'd like to echo everyone's thanks to the conference organizers for bringing us together today, and many thanks to you all for being here in person and in Zoom. I'm so honored and thrilled, especially to be gathering in person with this incredible group of Joyceans, especially as I'm just an honorary Joycean. I'm primarily an environmental humanist, as Kevin mentioned in his gracious introduction. But when I came to Ulysses with this sensibility, I found it surprisingly fertile ground, forgive the environmental pun, for eco-criticism. So with that, I'd like to introduce Mapping the Green Margins, Ecology and Modernity in Joyce's Ulysses. As Joyceans immemorial have maintained, Ulysses is not a novel of the modern city. It may well be the novel of the modern city. In the text, Joyce charts the experience of wandering the streets of dear, dirty Dublin, weaving through its innumerable polyphonic channels, and painstakingly representing its urban texture to the general exclusion of most geographies impertinent to the project of, as Joyce himself famously put it in words I'm sure none of you have heard during this conference, painting a picture of Dublin so complete that if one day the city suddenly disappeared, you know the rest, from the earth that could be reconstructed out of my book. Joyce evidently encouraged Ulysses' reputation as a strictly urban novel, shunting most allusions to natural environments and phenomena to the peripheries. And Fogarty suggests that this ecological exclusion was political for Joyce and represented a point of disagreement with contemporaries whom Joyce charged with failing to produce the sort of, quoting Fogarty here, outward-looking cosmopolitan literature that might bring about the spiritual and cultural renewal of Ireland in the strictly urbanist, anti-pastoral mode that Joyce himself may have adopted. Whether or not Joyce's ecological elisions were deliberate, critics of Ulysses have long pointed them out, contending that throughout the novel, the natural environment remains largely irrelevant and at least sublimated beneath the trappings of modernity. After all, this is the novel of the city. However, just beyond and beneath the modernizing metropolitan sprawl of Joyce's Dublin, Dame Nature threatens constantly, if surreptitiously, to burst forth, disrupting linear time and ordered space while troubling the boundaries between the ancient and the modern. Evidenced by the myriad intrusions of weather, flora, fauna, and natural unpredictabilities in Ulysses, Joyce's reception as a strictly urban literary cartographer is belied by his sustained attention to the unruly and excessive vicissitudes of the natural world, an attention dismissed by several of his modernist contemporaries, but acutely present in Ulysses' Homeric parallel, and represented in the famously disorderly formal qualities of Ulysses itself. From sandy Mount Strand to the Gibraltar of Mali's youth, to the rhododendron patch on Howth's Head, even to environmental phenomena like the lightning storm in the Oxen of the Sun episode, I wish to suggest that the natural landscapes in Ulysses are central to the novel's understanding of modernity as liminal, both technologically driven and inextricable from a slew of deterministic natural forces. Throughout the novel, urban temporality, marked by the pursuit of teleological, technological progress, is tempered by references to the chaotic natural world and its own overriding, expansive, and unpredictable temporalities, which bear heavily, if relatively invisibly, on the logistic and psychic functionalities of modern life. Developing upon the recent push in Joycean eco-criticism to reveal the ecological dimension of Joyce's modernism, I contend that by recentering the novel's green peripheries, we might attend to Joyce's understanding of modernity, again, not as a teleological narrative of progress and domination, but as a tenuous project haunted by the contingency, uncertainty, potentialities, and, as he has it, preponderant excesses of the natural world. Largely in response to an overwhelming intensification of environmental crises and inequalities, eco-criticism has formalized as a field only in the past few decades, attending broadly to the interconnections between nature and culture, specifically the cultural artifacts of language and literature, as Cheryl Glotfelty put it in her foundational introduction to the field. In general, eco-critics seek to foreground the material, non-human environment and artifacts of cultural production, positioning such landscapes as, per Lawrence Buell, not merely a framing device, but a presence that begins to suggest that human history is implicated in natural history. In other words, for a text to be ecologically oriented, it must engage with nature not as a passive backdrop, but as a character and agential force with active bearing on the narrative. Only in the past decade or so have scholars begun to advance readings of Joyce's famously urban-centered work that attends to its specifically and explicitly environmental dimensions. A recent volume edited by Robert Brazeau and Derek Gladwin has crucially addressed the ecological dimension of Joyce's work, exploring such subjects as embodiment in Dubliners to Ulysses' preoccupation with animals to the ecofeminist current in Joyce's later work. Still, the particular relationship in Ulysses between the modern city and the natural environment remains largely understudied. The few existing accounts of Ulysses' particular ecological dimensions have focused on the cyclical rhythms of the body and its interdependence with its material surroundings, an entanglement often read as Joyce's refutation of the Cartesian dualism on which much of the modernist project had been built. As Gary Leonard notes in his bravura reading of the Proteus chapter, the novel itself begins with a meditation on the natural world and its profound ensnarement with the body and mind. As Stephen Dedalus walks along Sandy Mount Strand, despite his reluctance, the material landscape begins to take precedence over the cerebral. When Stephen gazes out at the sea spawn and sea rack, the nearing tide, that rusty boot, he becomes, quote, aware of them bodies before of them colored. Straining to reject the natural material surroundings encroaching on his meditation, the ineluctable modality of the visible, represented by the title detritus before him, he implores himself to shut his eyes and see. However, the inescapable material input of the natural world remains. See now, Stephen concedes, there all the time without you, and ever shall be, world without end. The Cartesian dichotomy between mind and body, soul and environment, the very idea of a discrete modern subjectivity, comes unraveled on Sandy Mount Strand, undermining the aspirations of modernity to liberate the human subject from external considerations and perhaps from natural history itself. Rather than maintaining the stark modern separation between himself as a human subject and the natural world around him, Stephen situates himself within an ecological continuity, musing God becomes man, becomes fish, becomes barnacle, goose becomes featherbed mountain, dead breaths I living breathe, tread dead dust, devour a Uranus offal from all dead. When we first meet Leopold Bloom, he reiterates Stephen's focus on organic entanglement and natural cyclicality, meditating during the infamous outhouse scene on how manure, household slops, dung, and droppings might be ecologically regenerative. Bloom insists, dirty cleans, ashes too, reclaim the whole place, grow peas in that corner there, lettuce, always have fresh greens there. Bloom's understanding of interdependence and cyclicality in the garden outhouse represents a stark departure from the mechanistic, industrialized, more typically modern view of bodily rhythms which he describes elsewhere in the novel as the teleological process of, quote, stuffing food in one hole and out behind, food, blood, dung, earth, food, have to feed it like stoking an engine. As Bloom moves through the modern city, his experience of embodiment increasingly mirrors the urban alienation characterized by, again, quoting him here, trams passing one another, ingoing, outgoing, clanging, an onslaught of useless words, things going on same, day after day, squads of police marching out, back, trams in, out. This industrialized relationship to embodiment spurs Bloom's inchoate depression and his conviction that, quote, no one is anything, feel like I have been eaten and spewed. However, the natural world soon provides a rejoinder to this crushing urban repetition, reminding Bloom and his fellow Dubliners of modernity's contingency upon environmental phenomena and their more expansive, unpredictable temporalities. Beyond the machinations of the city, on Sandy Mount Strand, or even in the garden outhouse, Stephen and Bloom are momentarily able to escape the tempo of modern life and recognize an alternate cosmic cyclicality rooted in the vicissitudes of the natural world. As the novel continues, these natural interludes become less peripheral to the experience of the modern city and more fully woven into the fabric of modernity. Nature, for Joyce, is not a heap of raw material already conquered and rendered irrelevant by modernization, but instead, as American conservationist Aldo Leopold would later put it, the symbol of our untamable past, of that incredible sweep of millennia which underlies and conditions the daily affairs of men. The natural environment is integral to the modernist project as Joyce represents it in Ulysses, not a quaint relic on the margins of the modern city, but its psychic and material center. In the sense that, as Bruno Latour famously argued, we have never been modern, that is, that nature and society have never been sharply delineated, Joyce's Dublin is not a modern city, but a hybrid city. It is not a streamlined product of modern invention alone. It remains subject to natural rhythms, contingencies, and constant reminders that urban modernity has not escaped the same inscrutable and uncontrollable environmental determinants that have constrained progress since time immemorial. Just as in Ulysses' Homeric parallel, in Joyce's novel, nature continually interrupts and restructures, highlighting the contingency of human affairs upon the natural world and undermining the modern aspiration to master and transcend environmental limits. Weather, in particular, intrudes throughout the novel, shifting characters' trajectories just as unpredictably and uncontrollably as the thunderbolt that destroyed Odysseus' ship. When lightning strikes during the Oxen of the Sun episode, for instance, the tensions between modern productivity and natural occurrences emerge. After a hard drought in which the seed won't sprout, fields are athirst, very sad-colored, stunk mightily, the quags and toffs too, comes a swash of water, restoring life to the rosy buds all gone brown across the parched landscape. At first, Joyce couches the storm in the language of progress, efficiency, and improvement, the very hallmarks of urban modernity, suggesting that in Dublin, nature may have been convinced to do the modern's bidding after all. As Joyce puts it, for humans and their natural surroundings alike, in some an infinite great fall of rain and all refreshed will much increase the harvest. By this fertility-focused episode's own account, such a deluge might be celebrated, But the summer rain falling upon Dublin is immediately accompanied by a horrifying clap of thunder, which, for Stephen and for Joyce, shook his heart within the cage of his breast as he tasted the rumor of that storm. Especially given that the Homeric parallel to Ulysses' Thunderstorm involves the destruction of Odysseus' ship, this thrilling swash of water bearing life to fields athirst cannot be separated from its concomitant thunderclap, a harbinger of terror, uncertainty, and possible destruction. The natural factors that the moderns imagine they have harnessed quickly overflow their bounds, proving unmanageable. In the midst of the storm, Buck Mulligan makes the connection between nature, management, productivity, and progress even more explicit. To solve the, quote, problem of the national nuptial couch defrauded of its dearest pledges, a problem which grieved him plaguily, Buck proposes, again, quote, a national fertilizing farm to be named Omphalos, with an obelisk hewn and erected, wherein he would offer his dutiful yeoman services for the fecundation of any female of what grade of life soever. As tongue-in-cheek as Buck's great plan might be, it highlights a very real modern biopolitical paradigm working toward the quantitative management of land and people. As the storm rages outside, Buck articulates the modern impulse to harness the fundamentally unpredictable processes of ecology and biology in order to maximize output, profit, and productivity. Thunder and the natural world's unpredictability generally disrupts this ordering paradigm. Unlike the pastoral vision of rain as, quote, rain dew, moisture, life essence celestial glistening on Dublin stone there under starshine, a thunderstorm is excessive, disruptive, sublime, impossible to order or control. Despite Dubliners' most rational precautions, the storm gets in their shoes, in their ears, in their heads. Facing that same ineluctable modality of the visible that Stephen experienced on Sandy Mount Strand, it's unavoidable that his fellow Dubliners are utterly ensnared by the elements and overtaken by the rain. The thunderstorm embodies the overwhelming unruliness of ecological life. It encompasses not only the first lovely, hopeful drops of rain, but the sublime terror and chaos that follows. The storm forces Dubliners to all scamper pell-mell within door, abandoning all pretense of control and progressive temporality. Modernity's dependence upon the semi-opaque rhythms of the natural world is further echoed in the Ithaca episode, when, after Bloom turns on a faucet, he commences to meditate on the exact logistics of the technology bringing the water to him, and realizes that modern infrastructure is wholly contingent on its environmental inputs. Modernization does not exist on a separate plane from the natural. Rather, quoting from Ithaca, hydraulic mill wheels, turbines, dynamos, and electric power stations that constitute and make possible the urban landscape of Dublin depend upon harnessed tides or watercourses, rainstorms and flows that are subject to their own spatio-temporal laws beyond humanity's engineering capabilities. No matter how optimized and technologically advanced urban infrastructure may be, its functionality remains dependent upon those processes impossible even now to geoengineer. Rainstorms, snowfalls, droughts, tides. Nature subtends urban modernity and undermines the modernist imperative to render efficient. At one point, Bloom explicitly acknowledges that the natural world can only be managed, dominated, and understood to a point, musing that both natality and mortality, as well as all other phenomena of evolution, tidal movements, lunar phases, blood temperatures, diseases in general, everything, in fine, in nature's vast workshop, from the extinction of some remote sun to the blossoming of one of the countless flowers which beautify our public parks, is subject to a law of numeration as of yet unascertained. Or, to put it more bluntly, nature, we may rest assured, has her own good and cogent reasons for whatever she does. Reasons that the architects of modern society cannot yet divine or direct. Throughout Ulysses, nature and its alternate cosmic temporality subtend some of the most sensorially rich scenes. The rhododendron patch in Howth's Head where Bloom proposes, as well as Molly's remembrances of Gibraltar, both center the natural environment beyond and beneath urban Dublin, placing at the effective center of the novel the slow, material exigencies of the natural world. In contrast to the disorienting speed of the city, these are the places where the mind and body might merge, where joy becomes possible, where the self might be relinquished and actualized only for a moment, and where the tenet that we have never been modern is made apparent to modern subjects. In the Lestrygonians episode, Bloom's vivid remembrance of Hoth's Head illustrates the sublimity of surrendering to natural vicissitudes amid the ordered chaos of modern urban life. Bloom recalls lying with Molly years earlier in the sun's heat, hidden under wild ferns on Hoth's, below us bay sleeping, sky, no sound, the sky, the bay purple by the Lion's Head, green by Drumleck, yellow-green towards Sutton, fields of undersea, the lines faint brown in grass, buried cities, oh wonder. Dreamily, he remembers the rural texture of the episode. Flowers her eyes were, take me, willing eyes. Pebbles fell, she lay still, a goat, no one. High on Ben Hoth, rhododendrons, a nanny goat walking sure-footed, dropping currants. Screened under ferns, she laughed warm-folded. Wildly, I lay on her, kissed her. The fact that this reverie strikes Bloom in the midst of gloomily traversing the city illustrates the extent to which nature, as the psychic and logistical underpinning of modernity, has not yet been evacuated from the city. Instead, modern and natural temporalities, landscapes, and experiences remain entangled throughout the novel. The pastoral scene on Hoth's Head disrupts space and time, troubling boundaries between ancient and modern, and reminding Bloom of the cities buried beneath a modern palimpsestic Dublin. Here, beyond the city proper, with no sound, no one but himself and Molly and a nanny goat, Bloom experiences a sublime flash of joy. His recollection is not merely a pastoral fantasy, but a reminder of the profound ecological entanglements of modernity. Even within the rapidly modernizing city, natural landscapes and their reassuring cosmic temporalities remain, providing a counterweight to the occasionally disturbing, deadening, and rote facets of modern urban life. As Molly later exclaims in a recollection of her Gibraltar youth, God of heaven, there's nothing like nature, the wild mountains, then the sea, and the waves rushing, then the beautiful country with the fields of oats and what and all kinds of things that would do your heart good to see. At the novel's most effective anchor points, Joyce suggests that modernity and modern subjectivity still relies logistically and psychically on the vicissitudes of the natural world. Ultimately, the formal structure of Ulysses itself, the paradigm of literary modernism, fragmentary, marked by stream of consciousness, disjointed, notoriously difficult to comprehend, mirrors not a streamlined, technological, teleological modernity, but a modernity heavily inflected by the contingencies and inscrutable rhythms of the natural world. Like the novel's Homeric parallel, a narrative riven by unexpected storms and winds, inexplicable and destructive natural phenomena that thwart humanity's best laid plans, Ulysses is subtended by a recognition of the agential environment beyond the realm of human manipulation. For Joyce, this green modernism foregrounds the modern world's continued dependence on the environment, rather than its peremptory and final separation from it. The novel of the modern city, then, is ultimately not quite as dismissive of the natural world as it might initially appear. In Ulysses, Joyce not only makes space for the natural world within and beyond the urban landscape, but demonstrates the myriad ways that modernity does and must coexist with natural phenomena. Counter to the proclamations of contemporary observers who contended that modern life was becoming increasingly ethereal and abstracted from the material world, Joyce's modernism acknowledges an increasingly intense materialism and a profound dependency on the environmental resources that undergird modern life. Joyce demonstrates that the typical modernist dismissal of environmental contingencies remains not only misguided but impossible. To map Ulysses' vibrant, multivalent, rapidly urbanizing Dublin, one must account for the environment coursing through every bit of it, sustaining it, and undermining the modern fantasy of unchecked teleological progress untethered from the material world around it. Thank you.
I live in Philadelphia, and so I was already grateful to be here when I awoke to news of an ice storm warning in my hometown today and fell to the ground to kiss the unfrozen soil of Southern California. So I'm very grateful to be here with old friends and new here in this beautiful place, and just want to express my thanks to Karen and Kevin and Colleen and to Carla and all of our organizers and hosts. It's been a wonderful day so far. I'm going to begin my presentation by showing you an image not of a map, but of a photo, albeit a type of photo that's closely associated with maps, and it's actually a kind of image that has detained me a lot more than maps per se have. It's an aerial photograph, and this one is of Trieste. But it's not just any aerial photograph. This one was taken by an Italian plane during one of the 4 air raids Italy mounted during May and June 1915 as part of a campaign to reclaim Trieste from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. If the image were of a higher resolution, you'd be able to see the bombs dropping from the plane toward the city where James Joyce and his family were then living on the 2nd floor of Via Donato Bramante 4. Or maybe I should say 4 Via Donato Bramante 4. It was partly because of the terrifying commotion of the raids and partly because of the partial evacuation they prompted that the Joyces left Trieste for Zurich in June 1915. When I first came across this image a couple of decades ago in a manual of aerial photographic interpretation, I was stunned by its resemblance to maps of Trieste that I had seen, but also by the gulf that opened up between those maps and the photograph. The maps were schematized and often information-dense, full of street names and other toponyms. The aerial photo, by contrast, was a plan view of the city, intended not to facilitate navigation, commerce, or culture seeking, but to document barbarism in this case. Yet it too was full of information, if of a different kind. It also documented the absence of fog or low-flying cloud on the day that it was taken, the length and location of the wake left by a particular boat, and of course, the event of the bombing itself and the anti-aircraft response by the Triestine batteries. There was even the sense that, but for its limited resolution, one might zoom in to catch a bird's eye glimpse of Joyce or one of his family members or circle heading for cover. If a map was an abstract rendering of a space that filtered out the contingencies and obstructions that might afflict particular moments of seeing, the aerial photograph readmitted those contingencies and obstructions. It resubjected the map to time. What's more, it seemed to do so in a way that belonged to the project Joyce had begun by the time this photo was taken. For however much Ulysses is engaged with maps and mapping, it is more concerned to portray its target city on a particular day, contingencies, obstructions, and all. Now, aerial photos have a reputation for epitomizing the domineering God's eye view of militaries, governments, and corporations, those bad maps that Catherine Flynn spoke of so compellingly this morning. For seeing like a state, as James C. Scott would put it. Yet, as I learned more about the history and the technical dimensions of aerial photography, I came to see this reputation as a reductive one. During the First World War, aerial photos of large swaths of the Western Front were produced by stitching together dozens, even hundreds, of individual images. To produce these photo mosaics, as they were called, intelligence workers had to learn to correct each photograph for tilt, scale, radial distortion, exposure, and framing so that it would sync up properly with the neighboring images. After the war, former military photographers and map makers were employed by municipalities and private firms to make massive aerial maps of cities using the same techniques. This photo mosaic of Manhattan is just part of a larger image stitched together from 100 individual photos taken at an altitude of 10,000 feet on August 4th, 1921. A map of the greater New York area produced in 1924 for use by urban planners combined 2,000 photos taken by 3 planes over the course of several months. Although these photo mosaics formed the basis for many conventional maps during the interwar period, they belie the conceit of the map in several ways. As against both the atemporal conceit of the conventional map and the snapshot temporality of the single aerial photo, like the one I showed you of Trieste, they're polytemporal. They produce the illusion of simultaneity by compounding images taken hours, days, or even weeks apart. And they produce the illusion of seamless totality by way of elaborate techniques for rectifying, syncing, and blending. Yet despite those techniques, they contain residues of their scattered temporalities. If resolution permitted us to zoom in and zoom in again and zoom in again to a few adjacent sections of these images, we'd see shadows leaning in slightly different directions in adjacent panes of the photo, or unmelted snow on the ground in one, but not the next. So I want to suggest to you that these images are in their way no less strange than David Lilburn's prints in Medias Res, although the strangeness is of a different character. In addition to undergirding the city maps of the time, so these were the sort of state-of-the-art images of cities in the 1920s. This is something that we want to keep in mind here. Aerial photomosaics were a kind of cartographic unconscious. Even as they were touted for being the apotheosis of mapping, they also displayed what maps efface: the fact that the view from nowhere is a projection of many views from multiple somewheres and from multiple somewhens. Beneath the map, the countermap. And another way to say that is that the history of any map is a kind of countermap, insofar as that history opens up these disjointures and forms of illusion and simultanizing, I suppose we could say, that result in the single image. In calling interwar aerial surveys countermaps, I'm borrowing a word that entered the language much more recently, and in reference to rural rather than urban practices. The term countermapping was coined by the American sociologist Nancy Lee Peluso in a 1995 journal article. Peluso described how indigenous forest dwellers in Kalimantan, Indonesia, were appropriating the tools of the powerful, state maps and mapping technologies developed for large-scale resource extraction, to bolster the legitimacy of their own customary claims to forest resources. Since Peluso's article appeared, the term countermapping has expanded to include mapping against dominant power structures in many more scenarios, by non-indigenous communities as well as indigenous, in urban places as well as rural ones, and to many different ends beyond securing territorial resource claims. Migration studies scholar Amalia Campos Delgado, for instance, uses countermapping frameworks to study the cognitive maps created by Central American irregular migrants in transit through Mexico on the way to the US, reading their maps as disputing the meta-narrative of state-centric maps and making visible the physical, mental, and affective experiences of individual migrants. Here in Los Angeles County, the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, in collaboration with the Coalition for Economic Survival, has used GIS and LA Department of Housing and Community Development data to produce a time-lapse map of evictions from affordable housing based on Ellis Act statements in order to demand an amendment of the Act. This is a video of which I've just given you a screen capture, but it moves chronologically, and you can see these red dots sort of populating and gaining velocity as time goes by. And in Newcastle-on-Tyne, in the UK, a 2014 participant-led exhibition called Imagining Homelessness in a City of Care featured a hand-drawn map of the city incorporating annotations and life history excerpts by the project's 30 participants. And I think we can see a little bit of a kindred, maybe a family resemblance between this project and the In Medias Res maps. To return at last to James Joyce, I want to observe that the title of my talk, Countermapping Ulysses, implies that Joyce's novel is an object rather than an agent of countermapping. But when it comes to cartography, one of the most compelling things about Ulysses is that it engages in its own countermapping. This is something we've known since around 2003, 2004, when our own Eric Bolson and John Hegland, independently of one another, published articles on the ironic and decolonizing uses Ulysses makes of the British Ordnance Survey maps. The Ordnance Survey, as you heard in Greg's talk, first conducted in Ireland in the early 19th century, immediately following the Acts of Union and updated periodically, was an exercise of colonial state power, a project that anglicized or transliterated Irish place names and naturalized British possession under the sign of epistemological infallibility. Among the maps on which Joyce traced his characters' itineraries while working on the novel was the pocket version of the Ordnance Survey map of Dublin included with Tom's Directory for 1904 or 05. For Hegland, the Ordnance Survey as Ulysses deploys it ceases to be an authoritative and positivist account of the territory it covers and becomes, quote, an object of desire giving rise to projection and fantasy about different possible relationships between geographical space and community. An aesthetic object that prompts an ironic consciousness of geography and spatiality, end quote. Bolson, for his part, sees Ulysses' internal mapmaking as an adaptation of the Ordnance Survey from within, and as, quote, an act of reappropriation, a way to imagine Ireland as an independent nation in the not-so-distant future with a colonial past, end quote. In both of these important accounts, the novel does more than refuse or negate the map. It maps back, bending the Ordnance Survey to countervailing political purposes and exploring the emancipatory potential of alternative cartographies. So what are some examples of countermapping internal to Ulysses? Some are explicitly recited by characters in the novel, as happens in Aeolus, when Miles Crawford tells the story, and this is the scene that was read by Austin Williams right before lunch, as it happens. Miles Crawford tells the story of how Ignatius Gallagher, which is Joyce's name for the historical Fred Gallagher, both scooped other journalists and evaded the British censors by telegraphing a map of the Invincible's escape route in the Phoenix Park murders to the New York World, syncing positions on the map of Dublin to letters on a particular page of newsprint in the possession of the telegram's recipient. That was what was going on in that passage with all of the, let A equal such and such, let C equal such and such. The vignette offers both a practicum in the subversive cartographic workaround and a kind of allegory, as Bolson puts it, of Irish history waiting to be transmitted. The novel offers humbler conundrums in its countermapping problem sets, too, as when Bloom thinks in Calypso, good puzzle would be cross Dublin without passing a pub, a puzzle whose solution required software engineer Rory McCann to develop a special algorithm in 2011, and that dozens of thirsty flaneurs, cameras strapped to their chests, have reconfirmed since, as YouTube will instruct you. And of course, there's Wandering Rocks, whose relentless horizontality and hyperlinking imply the existence of the very thing it withholds, a conventional map of Dublin in which all the episode's places and place names can be glimpsed simultaneously in relation to one another. Like the aerial photomosaic maps I showed you earlier, Wandering Rocks reminds us that virtually every map offering itself as a totality reaped at a single glance is in fact a hallucination compounded of many partial and temporally discrete views and measurements and rectifications. As a way of building on Bolson's and Hegland's insights, I want to open up two types of countermapping in Ulysses that seem to me to deserve more attention than they've received. The first type asks an Irish studies approach to Joyce to learn from recent work in the field of Black geography, in particular to new itineraries and spatial adjacencies issuing from Black exilic thought. In her stunning 2019 book, The Black Shoals, Offshore Formations of Black and Native Studies, Tiffany Lethabo King describes time spent in Toronto in a crowd of Black and Indigenous people demanding the return of land in Caledonia to the Six Nations. As an African American raised in the tri-state area of the Delaware River Valley, King was unused to seeing Indigenous peoples in coalitions with other radical people of color groups. Yet in Toronto, she found that resisting the Canadian project of Indigenous genocide and colonialism was, quote, a part of the pulse of Black radical politics, end quote. In thinking about the conditions of possibility for this coalition, King focuses on Black Canadians', quote, acute diasporic sensibility of being in exile, their refusal to seek a comfortable resting space in the Canadian nation-state. She cites Black Canadian cultural studies scholar Ronaldo Walcott's description of the diasporic politics of Black Canada as, quote, located between the US and the Caribbean, and as oriented to home as an ethical place, not a narrative of containment. And she returns repeatedly to Walcott's rearrangement of conventional maps. It really detains her in the final chapter of The Black Shoals. Particularly his description in this classic study, Black Like Who, of Canadian Blackness's diasporic politics as located between the US and the Caribbean. King writes, the betweenness of which Walcott speaks, or this space of displacement, rearrangement, and suture, forces a rereading of the map of the Americas as well as a rereading of Black diaspora studies. Walcott's rearrangement is an explicit challenge to the traditions of centering either the US or the Caribbean in the field by establishing Black Canada as a crucial nexus. By placing it between the US and the Caribbean, Walcott suspends Canadian Blackness between the histories of Atlantic slavery, in which both the US and the Caribbean were primary destinations for enslaved people. He marks Canadian Blackness, too, as, quote, an absented presence always under erasure, end quote, at risk of disappearing between the more voluminous discourses around Afro-Caribbean and African-American history and identity. And maybe most spectacularly, he makes Canadian Blackness, rather than Canada, the nation state, the meeting point between various periods of Black immigration from both the US and the Caribbean, and a potential site at which to invent traditions for bringing different generations of Black diasporic subjects into conversation with one another. Now, I think we need to be very careful not to force an analogy between, say, Irishness and Canadian Blackness, or to minimize the differences between the experiences of diaspora among Irish subjects on the one hand and Black subjects in the Caribbean, the US, or Canada on the other. But I share King's sense of the importance of the counter-cartographic between in Walcott's formulation, of how powerfully it can locate not just diasporic itineraries, but also conditions of suspension, erasure, and mediation, as well as the prospect of new coalitions and conversations. What's more, asking what non-geographical betweens might be traced in Ulysses can bring us to new questions, not just about race and diaspora in Joyce's book, but also about how even its attenuated engagement with questions of indigeneity might be located in relation to broader settler colonial histories and itineraries. For example, how might we place a passage like this one on the book's map of Irish self-understanding? And this is from Wandering Rocks, and of course I'm dying to know what Shinjini would make of this passage, given her focus on tours and on horizontality. 2 carfuls of tourists passed slowly, their women sitting 4, gripping the handrests, pale faces, men's arms frankly around their stunted forms. They looked from Trinity to the blind column porch of the Bank of Ireland where pigeons roo-coo-cooed. The word paleface originated as a ventriloquism of Native American speech by white settler writers such as James Fenimore Cooper. It's not news that the word's appearance in Stephen's interior monologue analogizes settler colonialism in Ireland to settler colonialism in the US. It does so by constructing British tourists in Dublin as white settlers in North America, and by extension, the Irish as American Indians. The same word, we might remember, has already occurred to Stephen in Telemachus. This is actually how we know this is Stephen Daedalus's interior monologue and not Artiphones, who's also in this scene. When Stephen, again in Telemachus, imagines Oxford students hazing a boy named Clive Kempthorpe. And in that episode, it works in circuit with the indigenization of the elderly milkwoman, whom Mulligan calls an islander to the paleface Haynes, who in turn assumes that she speaks Irish. The Gaeltacht, apparently, is located between Oxford and Dublin. It's also not news that the citizen makes the same analogy explicit in Cyclops, when he gives the Times of London a culturally genocidal attitude toward Irish famine migrants, in the process using an offensive word for Native Americans that, like paleface, has its origins in American white settler discourse. If we follow the lead of King and Walcott, though, we might also read these passages as moments of countermapping that pull North America out of the offshore margins of Joyce's novel and relocate it, quote, between the UK and Ireland. Sorry, those are quotes designating a formulation of my own. I know it sounded like I was quoting another writer. So relocating North America between the UK and Ireland. Why? Because the vocabulary of Irish self-understanding under British settler colonialism is routed in these passages through the cultural nerve center of North American white settler vocabularies. This is obviously a very different kind of between from Walcott's location of Canadian Blackness between the US and the Caribbean. But like Walcott's remapping, it transforms what has formerly been understood as a marginal link into a central hub. Not uncritically so, I want to stress here, for by foregrounding white settler terms for both the indigenous and settler groups involved in North American settler colonialism, these passages insist on Catholic Ireland's linguistic and cultural complicities with that settler project, and by implication on Irish Americans and Irish Canadians having been the material beneficiaries of that project. But without ignoring the problematic terms in which it's articulated, we can observe that the analogy between the two settler colonial projects also stands as a site of possible decolonial coalitions. Witness the fact that Stephen and the citizen, who don't occur in any scenes together in Ulysses and whose politics really couldn't be more skew from one another, have this analogy in common. I'd like to turn now and briefly to a second type of countermapping internal to Ulysses before I wrap up, and this one has to do with temporality. It was Enda Duffy who pointed out in the subaltern Ulysses that in one of the later interpolations in the Cyclops episode, the course followed by the procession of saints is precisely that from the center of the rebellion, the General Post Office on Sackville Street to Barney Kiernan's through some of the streets that were worst hit by British shelling in the Easter Rebellion. Many of you will have seen photos like this one of the Dublin city centre shelled to ruins by the British soldiers who put down the rebellion. But this insurance assessor's map of the buildings damaged in the Rising, with orange denoting partial destruction and red simply destruction, I suppose we could sort of further annotate that by saying claims of partial destruction and claims of destruction, more precisely illustrates Duffy's point about the countermapping Joyce does in the Cyclops passage, in part because it's that most conventional of maps, a cadastral map, which is to say a map that focuses on the delineation of individual properties. Joyce's procession of saints, quote, wended their way by Nelson's Pillar, Henry Street, Mary Street, Capel Street, Little Britain Street, chanting the introit in Epiphania Domini, which beginneth Surge Illuminare, doing diverse wonders such as casting out devils, raising the dead to life, multiplying fishes, healing the halt and the blind, blessing and prophesying. If we do what this passage bids us do through its itinerary and through its repeated references to raising and rising, Surge Illuminare, and the raising of the dead, if we imagine a saintly procession in a novel set in 1904, wending its way through a cadastral post-rising map from 1916, we see that Ulysses is a punctual text set on a single actual day, yet riven with subtle anachronisms. We behold with special clarity that Joyce's countermapping includes not only the reappropriation of spatial meaning, but also a miraculous slippage in the gears of time. What would it mean to do justice to Ulysses' countermapping in our teaching and our scholarship about Joyce's book? Well, that's a question too big for me to tackle here. The best I can do is to speculate that it might mean telling stories that are no longer fixated on the book's painstaking fidelity to the map of Dublin in 1904, stories that are about the cities named or implied by Ulysses, or about the forests or plains or deserts between Dublin and those other cities. It could mean plugging 1904 into the switchboards of other years and other urgencies so that they too become unsettled in time and cast new shadows on Joyce's monument in turn. Imagine embracing anachronism as a refusal of standard issue chronopolitics, reading Ulysses by the light of 21st century Dublin maps of crime and gentrification, sewage and secularism. Or imagine turning to non-geographical betweens as a rejoinder to orthodox cartopolitics. We might at last learn to hear Bloom's words in Lestrygonians as something other than a lament about the endless waves of death and birth in a single city, as instead a countermap of multiple cities strung loosely together in the dark. Cityful passing away, other cityful coming, passing away too, other coming on, passing on. Thank you.
Our panel, I think you will agree, is, to paraphrase Auden, great content, little room. We had kind of a short space, and we've only got about 5 or 6 minutes nominally, anyway, for questions. We might be able to try to stretch that out, which is just to say, if you have a question, don't be shy. Let's just have it. We've got do we have mics? Yeah, we've got mics at the back, so if you have a question in the room, Professor Shore has one.
That was such a wonderful panel, and of course I want to ask everyone a question. I was especially haunted by the way the entire universe was invoked at the very beginning of Greg's talk and then came back at the end of Paul's. a Dickensian looking at Joyceans often thinks, well, they think that Ulysses is the whole universe, and it's not. But I have to say, this panel kind of convinced me that it was. So I'm a tad abashed. But I want to go to a small element in Paul Saint-Amour's paper and the Aeolus passage that came up in the reading before we dispersed to lunch, when I think we were all only a little bit listening because we were thinking about coffee. And that is telegraphy as another form of codification or mapping, or rather than countermapping, a dissolution of mapping, a kind of taking the map apart, moving it through another text cryptonomically, and then reassembling it in another location. And I wonder if you want to talk about the way maps are not only assembled through lots of different perspectives, but then disassembled and reassembled elsewhere through an entirely different medium, the telegraph being only one possible such device.
Thank you, Hillary. That's a wonderfully suggestive question, and all I can say is I wish I were Richard Menke and actually knew anything about telegraphs. But that dismantling of a map and sort of sending it by way of a transatlantic cable for it to be reassembled, it's almost like the fax machine is being kind of oddly kind of invented avant la lettre. And in a way, it also suggests to me a kind of reversal by dispersal of the kind of patient assembly of those photomosaic maps, right? And the idea that a map can sort of survive being dismembered and sent through space. I feel like Dr. McCoy about to say, I don't want to step onto that transporter and have my atoms scattered through space, but it does enchain Dublin into a series of cities where those maps can be dispersed, replicated, reinterpreted. And I think it is actually part of that. We could think about the telegraph as one part of the history of non-geographical betweens, right? That are setting up adjacencies and relationships between cities by way of diasporic itineraries, and in this case, a kind of diasporic technology. But I would have to again invoke somebody or invite somebody who knows a lot more about telegraphy to really nail that down. Thank you for that question.
Colleen, is there anything online?
Yes. There's a question for Paul. How might you imprecate the lynchings in North America represented in Ulysses as part of Joyce's countermap?
Could you, Colleen, just repeat the first part of that question? I heard the word lynching, but I wasn't sure of the rest of the sentence.
It says, thanks for a fabulous panel. And this is from Suzette Henke. Thanks for a fabulous panel. Paul, how might you imbricate the lynchings in North America represented in Ulysses as part of Joyce's countermap?
Yeah, I think there are a number of moments of engagement with Ulysses, and if you have ever taught this book, you know that they can be very challenging moments in the classroom because of the way that the book is celebrated for its sort of emancipatory racial politics, and yet includes moments of great racism. There's the moment of racial pantomime in Circe, and the question of how to think about those moments as replications of racial pantomime and other racist practices, versus as replications that engage in critique is a really challenging one. Not to say that lynching works in the same way, but I think that both of those are instances where, again, North America, and particularly race politics in North America, are not just things kind of going on in the periphery that seep into the center. I think they're being put center stage at moments, right? Circe is a kind of an inversion of the topography of the rest of the novel. Things that tend to remain on the margins in more conventional novels are given center stage. And I think we have an inversion of geography as well. And those are moments when I think we could say that Joyce's book is participating in a kind of countermapping of the whiteness of this book and of its reception by insisting repeatedly that the ostensible whiteness of the Irish, and in other kinds of, especially 19th century racist ethnographic constructions, the blackness of the Irish, are sort of centrally on the mind of this text, right? And that it's far from just inviting us to sort of learn the map of Dublin and forget about the rest of the world. That map of Dublin is a switchboard through which the rest of the world is being brought into play and into critique and also into complicity, right? And I think we need to remember that those two things are, the gears of both of those relations are meshing very deeply in this text.
I'm going to make an executive decision and take us one question into overtime. So is there one more in the audience? Yes.
I have a question for Megan. I'm curious how the Nausicaa chapter plays into looking at the green margins or maybe the blue margin, especially because Bloom is, he's watching Gertie, but he's also watching the beach, but is more removed than Stephen is on Sandy Mount Strand. And what your thoughts are on that, whether that's sort of more the green is bleeding into kind of Bloom's position or vice versa.
Yeah, that's a great question. Can everybody hear me? Okay, great. So Nausicaa, I think, is an interesting case because with Gertie and in that whole chapter, everything is very mediated. As many Joyce critics have pointed out, her perception of everything is kind of filtered through the language of advertisements and through media in general. So if I can find it super quickly, I remember that the opening of the chapter is kind of this idyllic, picturesque description of the beach that's very different from Stephen's sea spawn and sea rack. Yes, the summer evening had begun to fold the world in its mysterious embrace. Far away in the west, the sun was setting, etc. It's this really beautiful, romanticized portrait of nature and the rhetoric that Gertie uses throughout the entire episode. So going back to the Lawrence Buell in my presentation, his formulation of an eco-critically oriented text, again, is something wherein nature, the environment, is not merely symbolic of something else, it's not a stand-in for something else or mediated by something else, it is the material environment itself. So I think that's why I did not include Nausicaa in my talk, because it's mediated rather than directly material. So thank you.
Can we thank our panelists one more time? So we're on the verge of heading back outdoors, and what we're going to do, because we're heading outdoors, is to collapse our next two Ulysses on the clock moments, which really should be two hours apart, but they're going to be 5 minutes apart, so that we can see them both and our online audience can see them, and then we're going to head out. So what's on your program for 3 to 3:05, the excerpt from Sirens will be followed then immediately by the excerpt from Cyclops.
Bronze by gold heard the hoof iron's steely ringing, impertinent, chips picking chips off rocky thumbnail, chips, horrid, and gold flushed more, a husky fife note blue. Blue bloom is on the gold pinnacled hair, a jumping rose and satiny breasts of satin, rose of Castile, trilling, e Dolores, peep, who in the peep of gold? Tink, cried to bronze in pity, and a call pure, long and throbbing, long and dying called, decoy, soft word, but look, the bright stars fade. Oh, Rose, notes chirruping answer, Castile, the morn is breaking, jingle, jaunted, jingling. Coin rang, cluck clacked, a vowel, sonnet, I could, rebound of garter, not leave thee, smack, la cloche, thigh smack, a vowel, warm, sweetheart, goodbye. Jingle, blue, bloom, crashing chords, when love absorbs, war, the tympanum. A sail, a veil, a wave upon the waves, lost, throstle, fluted, all is lost now. Horn, hawthorn. When first he saw, alas, full tup, full throb, warbling, alluring. Martha, come. Clap, clop, clip, clap, clappity, clap. Good God, he never heard in all. Deaf ball pat brought pad, pat knife took up. A moonlit night call, far, far. I feel so sad. P.S. So lonely, blooming. Listen. The spiked and winding cold sea horn. Have you the? Each and four other plash and silent roar. Pearls, when she lists rhapsodies. Hiss. You don't? Did not. No, believe. Lidded with a cock, with a cara. Black, deep sounding, do bang, do. Wait while you wait, hee, wait while you hee, but wait, low in dark middle earth, embedded ore, Namina denamina, all gone, all fallen, tiny her tremulous fern falls of maiden hair, amen, he gnashed in fury, fro to fro, a baton cool protruding, bronze Lydia by Mina gold, by bronze, by gold, in ocean green of shadow, bloom, old bloom, when wrapped, when tapped with a carrow of a cock, pray for him, pray good people, his gouty fingers knackering, Big Ben, Big Ben. Last rose Castile's summer left bloom. I feel so sad, alone. Puis, little wind piped we. True men, listen, Carl D and doll. Aye, like you men. We lift your chink with chink. We're bronze from an ear, we're gold from afar, we're hoofs. Candle. Then, till not till then, my epiphraph be for it. Done. Begin. Clearly, I was asked to read this because of my mellifluous voice. Now, the start of Sirens, as has been well rehearsed in criticism, functions like the exposition to a fugue, in that it consists of a succession of short, often abbreviated or syncopated quotes from elsewhere in the episode, mostly but not quite in order, and thus it serves as a listing of the various themes and motifs of the episode, such as Boylan's famous jingle. It also works as a model of Joycean intertextuality, as the decontextualized snippets create new patterns of association in this new juxtaposition, such as a husky five-note blue and blue. Blue bloom is on the, and then gold pinnacled hair. So, with the repetition of bloom created by this new context, we see the kind of model of text proliferating text. Blue, blue bloom. Creating new music, as it were. We also see in Sirens, and even in this overture, the start of a new stylistic mode in Ulysses that will carry us through to at least Circe, if not beyond, a double mimesis, that is, a representation of action through a creative imitation of style. And this friction between the two modes of mimesis occasions new possibilities.
The Cyclops chapter of Ulysses takes its name from one of the most fascinating stories told in Homer's Odyssey. No other story, I think, reveals so much about the complex character of Odysseus. Above all, how his reckless urge to experience everything he can in the course of his long voyage home leads him and his men into a trap from which he liberates them by means of his wits as much as by anything else. Essentially, it's a story of how brains vanquish brawn. It aptly ends with the Cyclops vainly throwing huge rocks at Odysseus and his men as the Greeks sail away. So it was a master stroke for Joyce to base the overbearing citizen of this chapter on a real-life Irish athlete who specialized in putting the shot, especially since the final act of the drunken citizen is to vainly throw a biscuit tin, a cookie box, at the departing Bloom, a parody of shot putting. And as of course you know, the Cyclops' episode is punctuated by parodies, passages of gigantically inflated prose that are meant to parody epic poetry, more precisely what has been called translator-ese, the language often used in translations of ancient epics, where everything is oversized, overwrought, overstated, and often larded with compounds like deep-chested and strong-limbed. The passage I'm going to read is a perfect example. It's not spoken by the narrator of the episode. You can tell that at once. It's not anything that he would say to other people in the pub. It's not spoken by the narrator of the episode, but rather written by a figure whom critics have come to call simply the parodist, who translates the realistically modern story of men drinking and arguing in a Dublin pub. He translates this modern story into the kind of language we associate with epic. So here's the first thing the parodist writes about the citizen who is sitting on a bar stool waiting for the pint of beer that has just been offered to him by Joe Hines. The figure seated on a large boulder at the foot of a round tower was that of a broad-shouldered, deep-chested, strong-limbed, frank-eyed, red-haired, freely freckled, shaggy-bearded, wide-mouthed, large-nosed, long-headed, deep-voiced, bare-kneed, brawny-handed, hairy-legged, ruddy-faced, sinewy-armed hero. From shoulder to shoulder he measured several ells, and his rock-like mountainous knees were covered, as was likewise the rest of his body, wherever visible, with a strong growth of tawny, prickly hair, in hue and toughness similar to the mountain gorse, Ulex europaeus. The wide-winged nostrils, from which bristles of the same tawny hue projected, were of such capaciousness that within their cavernous obscurity the field lark might easily have lodged her nest. The eyes, in which a tear and a smile strove ever for mastery, were of the dimensions of a good-sized cauliflower. A powerful current of warm air issued at regular intervals from the profound cavity of his mouth, while in rhythmic resonance the loud, strong, hail reverberations of his formidable heart thundered rumblingly, causing the ground, the summit of the lofty tower, and the still loftier walls of the cave to vibrate and tremble.